Hello, how are you, Tatiana? You okay?
I'm fine, thank you, John.
Very good. Have you had a nice day?
Great, great
Fantastic.
day. Yeah,
Are you ready for part three of Van Dyke?
I'm always ready for Van Dyke and also for the others.
Fantastic. Always ready for our drawing from history workshops. So, everyone, welcome. It's Monday night, and Monday night means drawing from history. And I'm delighted to welcome you all back for part three in our series on Sir Anthony van Dyke, one of the greatest painters, not just of the 17th century and the first half of the 17th century, more specifically, but also I think that he's one of the greatest painters in the whole history of Western art, for reasons that we have been discussing over the last couple of weeks. Now, I am recording the video and I'm going to upload it to YouTube tomorrow morning, and that means that you'll all be able to watch the video back and make use of it as much as you like. And you can also share it with friends who you think might benefit from some art history from this kind of perspective. We have quite an interdisciplinary approach at drawing from history. We don't just look at the paintings and discuss the painting itself or the artwork itself, but we also discuss a lot about the cultural background in which the painting arose, and we talk about the materials. We do some technical art history. Last week's workshop went quite deep into the materials and the techniques and the actual manner in which the painting was executed by Van Dyke and who influenced Van Dyke's manner of execution as an artist, as a painter. Tonight, our focus is going to be still on Van Dyke's sort of early, not so much his early period, but his period before entering the court of Charles I. Okay, so it's in 1632 that Sir Anthony van Dyke, well, Anthony van Dyke becomes Sir Anthony van Dyke in 1632 because he enters the court of Charles I. He obliges the king's request to become a court painter. He settles in London and he's there basically permanently. He does attempt to resettle in Italy again, but that isn't a success, and he returns to London, and then he dies in 1641, quite a young man at the age of 42. And he's then interred at St. Paul's Cathedral. That the fact that he's buried in St. Paul's Cathedral speaks of how significant he was to the English aristocracy and to the English elite during his life. He had a career in London from 1632 onwards until his death, and him being interred at St. Paul's Cathedral is very, very significant. And the fact that he was knighted upon basically upon becoming court painter, it speaks of how prestigious he was and how sought after and respected as an artist he was. So we're going to look at the period leading up to that, okay, leading up to his entry into the court of Charles I. And the reason for that is because from 1632 onwards, Van Dyke's career basically reshapes and reforms the culture of British art. You wouldn't have the aesthetic of Reynolds or Gainsborough or Sir Peter Lely or William Dobson or Godfrey Kneller. These are all subsequent artists that execute English portraits of English intellectual, aristocratic, monarchic, and mercantile elites, and cultural elites like musicians, etc. None of them can be really understood or appreciated without appreciating the influence that Van Dyke had on English painting. And for that reason, Van Dyke's output and his work from 1632 onwards is going to be the subject of another series. Okay, so we'll do 3 parts on Van Dyke after 1632. This 3-part series has been about Van Dyke from his early career as an apprentice to Hendrik van Balen and as an assistant to Rubens, and then his experience in Antwerp in England, very brief experience in England in 1621, and then a consolidation of his own distinctive style in Italy. And it's the consolidation or the development of his own distinctive style, or a more individually distinctive style, which Van Dyke cultivated in Italy. Basically, what Van Dyke does after leaving England in 1621 is he goes back to Flanders, he goes back to Antwerp, and then he leaves for Italy. He travels around Italy, he visits Palermo. He's in Palermo in 1624, as we already know, because that's where he meets Sophonisba Angusola, the great Cremonese portraitist who then worked at the court of the Spanish monarchy. He met her in 1624, as we all know, but he spends most of his time in Genoa, and that is where Van Dyke really, I suppose, comes of age, and he actually consolidates his own sort of approach. And he's quite a hybridized artist because, well, as we'll see, he grapples with two distinct types of portraiture. And I think that's a good time to enter right into our workshop. This is just our intro screen with a beautiful 1629 self-portrait, which is currently in a private collection. All right, so let's get into it. And those of you watching on YouTube, enjoy. And those of you here with me right now on Zoom, enjoy. And do unmute if you want to ask a question. Okay, I really love it. You know, last week there were some great questions, and the week before, Anne and Rian contributed some really lovely ideas and interpretive ideas. So it's you know, really great when people do ask questions and share insights as well. But obviously, if you don't want to be recorded, then you don't have to unmute at all. You can just enjoy and feel comfortable that, you know, you can just sit back and enjoy and draw, of course, and take notes if you like. All right, so this is where we'll start this week. It's basically where we finished off last week, isn't it? I think we had a quick glimpse at this painting last week. I'm just going to grab my headphones so that I don't hear any of the background noise in my own home, and so that I think it will make the sound quality better for you as well. And they are here. So I've got my little doggy on the floor as well, so he might make an appearance at some point this evening. So here we are. We've got this wonderful portrait of a man, so called, as it's titled. And the reason it's just called that is because we don't know who this man is. We can see that he's got some jewellery. He's got a ring on his right thumb. He's got another ring, perhaps a bejeweled ring, on his little finger on his left hand there. He's wearing, you know, fairly expensive clothes. These are not, this is not a peasant, okay? This is not a person who belongs to the peasant class. He's occupying a fairly grand surroundings with this classical architecture, these nice pillars. There is a beautiful landscape in the background, and last week when we looked at some of Van Dyke's portraits, you could see that he combined the portrait format with a landscape in the background. Classical architecture is something that Van Dyke was quite you see quite commonly in Van Dyke's portraiture. But this is not necessarily an aristocrat. If we were looking at an aristocrat here, we'd probably see a few other things. You know, there'd probably be some symbols of a coat of arms, perhaps, in Van Dyke's great equestrian portrait of Charles I, which hangs in the National Gallery in London. Charles has insignia of the Order of the Garter around his neck, one of the most important chivalric orders, the one established by Edward III during the 100 Years' War in the 14th century. There's no allusion to aristocraticism here other than the attire. And so what we might reasonably infer is that this gentleman, while not being an aristocrat, is still a gentleman, but would belong to the mercantile elite or the administrative elite or what we might refer as the burgher class. Early modern society, after the Middle Ages, with the rise of, well, basically the end of the Middle Ages is a slow and gradual process into the Renaissance, and then from the Renaissance into the post-Renaissance and the 17th century. The Renaissance we're in a completely different time now. This is no longer the Renaissance, but throughout early modernity as a whole, which is a period from the end of the Middle Ages right up until the modern age, I would say that the modern age really begins with the French Revolution in 1789. That's the dawn of the modern world. So early modernity, within early modern society, there are really three main classes of people. You have the peasantry, that's most of us. Most people are peasants, more than 90% of people are peasants. And then you have aristocracy. And the aristocracy include the monarch. The monarch is one of the aristocrats who supersedes the rest of the aristocracy to the throne and occupies the most elite position. And then you have the people in between the peasants and the aristocrats, and they are the burghers. The burghers are the more urbanized economic elite who occupy bureaucratic, administrative, mercantile, legal, financial professions. Okay, and they're the diplomats and the merchants, sometimes very successful artisans. Now, there was mobility within those tiers or within that hierarchy, because someone like Sir Peter Paul Rubens wasn't from an aristocratic background. He was knighted. So was Anthony van Dyke. Anthony van Dyke was from that burgher class, the class of the merchants, the mercantile elite, the economic, the people who had done well in the cities because of trade and commerce. And he did ascend into the aristocracy. He did ascend into the ranks of the nobility in England, as I mentioned at the very beginning, in 1632, when he's made he's knighted. He's given a knighthood. This gentleman doesn't appear to be an aristocrat, and what this shows us, looking at this painting, is that not only aristocrats were painted. We often think of early modern painting and early modern portraiture as being really just about the kings and queens and the monarchs. And the true history is actually far more complex than that. And there is a bit of a conflict within the history of painting at this time. Because with Sir Anthony van Dyke, he doesn't just paint aristocrats, and aristocratic portraiture isn't the only type of portraiture in this early 17th century, and there isn't only one type of elite person at this point. There are the mercantile elites who are becoming increasingly influential and increasingly powerful. And there is also a rupture in Europe in the 16th century. So in the century before Van Dyke, in 1517, the Protestant Reformation comes to a head. And later on in that very same century, there is a Catholic Reformation. So Europe is divided spiritually, and it's also divided in terms of these two different castes of people. And I say caste instead of class, because the idea of class conflict is a very modern idea, which is derived primarily from Karl Marx. Whereas we have a more of a caste-based society, a caste-based division in early modern society. The aristocrats are a caste. They're a military, they're a spiritual elite as well. And they are a land-owning military elite, whereas the merchants, they are of a lesser caste. It's perceived to be it's not a noble mode of living. It's a lesser mode of being, to be a merchant, to be a bureaucrat, to have an administrative or a legal profession. That's the way it's perceived at the time. The idea of class is a very modern idea. Okay, so we're in a traditional world here in the 17th century. In the early modern world, there's a different sort of perception about this. Okay, and within this caste difference between aristocrats and burghers, there is a different style of portraiture, and this can also, our understanding of this difference can also be understood within the context of Reformation, Protestant Reformation and Catholic Reformation. So if you look at Rembrandt's paintings from the early 17th century as well, they mainly depict they have a more secular approach, and they reflect more on the mercantile and economic elite in the Dutch Republic. Anthony van Dyke, by contrast, exhibits a very refined approach to both types. There is a kind of conflict in portraiture at this time between the aristocratic portrait and, you know, the portraits of the aristocratic caste or the aristocratic elite and the mercantile elite. And they do have a different style. They do have a different aesthetic. One, you know, with Van Dyke, these paintings of the mercantile elite are typical of his earlier work. They're typical of his first Antwerp period, where he's a young, highly skilled, professional painter. He's very experienced, having been the chief assistant to Sir Peter Paul Rubens. When Van Dyke was just 19, he was recognized as Rubens's greatest assistant and greatest pupil. And the attire of the mercantile elite, these great traders and these great administrators, you know, these bureaucrats, they're often dressed in this very, very fine black fabric. And so is Van Dyke, you know, that self-portrait that we were looking at last week, where Van Dyke is wearing a very, very fine black cloak, is he painting himself as an aristocratic elite or as a mercantile elite? He's certainly aware of himself as some kind of elite. He's certainly within the artistic elite. Now, Van Dyke does actually belong to one of these castes in his early life, because his father was a very, you know, a successful cloth merchant. So cloth could be imported and exported, and luxury items had begun to be very, very lucrative because of the buying power of the new burgher class, the new mercantile elite. And so there was much money to be made through dealing luxury products. And we can see examples of this here in the jewelry and the garb. Okay. And Van Dyke belongs to that mercantile class. He becomes an artist, he's apprenticed. He then becomes a highly successful artist, and he becomes a highly successful artist at the time in which the artists are becoming increasingly recognized as possessing a higher order level of skill and ability. They're becoming increasingly recognized as important cultural ambassadors for the people that they represent, and so they're highly sought after. Oh, my little boy has come over to say hello to me. I'll have to pick him up and show you my little dog at some point in the class. He might get restless and want to go downstairs, but as I'm here on my own at the moment, I'll have to look after him. I'll have to multitask. I don't know if you can see him. Can you see him there? No, he's just down here. He's interested in all the skulls I've got in my studio, because obviously dogs like bones. And so yeah, where was I? Actually, I better actually get to some of my notes. I've just been rambling out of my head and I don't know where I am. So I better actually look at this. I've really enjoyed putting today's workshop together, you see, and you probably know that it's all swimming around in my head, all of the sort of research I've been doing, you know, and so it's just coming out in a rather kind of spontaneous way. So I ought to get to my notebook at some point. Oh, there he is. It's like, oh, it's so sweet. So anyway, so look, let me get back to it. So with this painting, yeah, we don't know, probably a merchant class from Antwerp. But this painted, as you can see in the bottom right, where I've written, you know, the dates of this painting, it's painted between 1620 and 1621, or thereabouts, circa 1620 to 1621. We don't know who this man is, possibly a member of the merchant class of Antwerp, or is he an Englishman? We know that Van Dyke was in England in between 1620 and 1621, but only for a few months. So this painting could have been painted before he left Antwerp for London, for England, or it could have been painted upon his return before he left Flanders for Italy. He was in Italy for a number of years. He would then return to Flanders in 1627 after having a pretty successful time in Italy, spending most of that time in Genoa. So could this be, I suspect that this is a merchant, a Flemish merchant. This is typical of his Flemish paintings. There's a lot of debate about this painting, who it's of, and whether it's been painted before he left for England in 1620 or whether it's painted after. Some people even propose that this is actually a portrait from his Genoese period because of the maturity and the handling of the paint. Now, if we're going to talk about the handling of the paint, it would make more sense for us to finish our sketch that we're doing now and take a closer look at the painting, which is what we're going to do now, actually. So I hope you've done a really nice, I might give you a few moments actually, because that's not fair. So the last few moments to sketch this painting before we look at something that we're going to compare this painting to, and then move on to a close-up of this gentleman's face and head, okay? So the handling of the paint, the palette, the composition, and also I've written down here, mise en scène, which is the placement of the objects within the painting. So that chair, for example, is quite reminiscent of other paintings of his first Antwerp period. And I would say that his first, in 1619, before he went to England, before Van Dyke went to England, he painted a fabulous portrait, which I'd mentioned but didn't show you last week. It's Cornelius van der Geest, a fabulous, really close up cropped painting on a little oak panel, which is in the National Gallery. And to say that the handling of this painting exhibits a level of maturity which suggests that it was from after his Genoese period, I think is very questionable, because this painting, you can see my doggy now. Hello, Rocco. You're such a good, wonderful creature. He in that painting, that earlier painting from 1619, the level of skill is completely ridiculous. It's the lead white paint for the flesh has been handled with such looseness. It's almost as though it hasn't been created by human hands. The contrivance and the effort that goes into painting just doesn't exist in that piece. It's as though it's so natural. It's as though it's flowed out from some mysterious kind of creative force, and isn't the product of human hands and human contrivance and human labor. And that's a very early work by Van Dyke, which shows that he was mature enough by that point to easily execute this. And I think that when we take a closer look at this painting, you'll see even more clearly what it is I mean. He's got a similar expression to the Cornelius van der Geest, a very sort of ambiguous sort of gaze, a melancholic gaze, and a very liquidy, moist sort of eye as well, which is similar to the Cornelius van der Geest, which was painted in 1619. So there we go. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the self-portrait that we've already seen, but just because it helps us understand more sort of developmental stages that Van Dyke's going through at this time. So here's that self-portrait, which is at the Met and painted between 1620 and 1621, just like the portrait of man, so from the same sort of period. Now, this doesn't seem to be handled as carefully as the portrait we just looked at. The hair is very, very good, but the face is not as finely modeled as the canvas on the previous slide, which I've shown you. He is looking very much like, dressed like someone of the burgher class, but with some aristocratic flair in his poise, in his engagement with the viewer. It's very personable. It's almost like he's looking in the mirror or looking at someone he knows. He's painting himself as a youngster with great potential, I think, and he would eventually become an aristocrat. He would be knighted in 1632. So a mere, decade or so after this painting. And then a decade after that, he'd no longer be with us because he died in 1641. So, yeah, there's a similarity between these two paintings. They both reflect the one type of portraiture more than the other, which is the portraiture of the more secular elite, the more mercantile elite, the burgher class, rather than the aristocratic one. So there's an ambiguity here. He's somewhat on the air. He's somewhat between the two in his self-portrait, this early self-portrait. He's somewhere between aristocraticism and the merchant. And I think that Van Dyke, we all know that in the end, his primary output would be aristocratic and portraits of Charles I and his court and other great English noblemen who were active during the English Civil War, and from the late 1630s up until 1649, and arguably longer. The Civil War kind of lasted longer than didn't just end in 1649 when Charles I was executed, but we associate Van Dyke himself really with portraits of the Englishmen during the English monarchy and aristocracy during the English Civil War. And so he's more of an aristocratic painter than a merchant painter, but he's someone who's brilliant at both and is an exponent of both. So let's now take a closer look at this. So here, this is what I wanted us to really see, which is the head and face of this gentleman who is probably, I would argue, Flemish merchant, perhaps a patron of the arts. This is one of the things with the wealthy merchant class in Flanders and in Antwerp at this time, just like Cornelius van der Geest was. These are very, very wealthy society people, and a lot of them are very supportive of the artists. Cornelius van der Geest was a collector of paintings, and he was a great supporter of artists who were emerging. You had the phenomenon of the wealthy merchant elite who wanted to support the careers of talented individuals within the arts. And that's something that you might associate with patronage today, but it also existed back then. And this could be an example of that. And I would argue, on the basis of my very limited research into this painting, that this would be an example of that sort of thing, and that sort of relationship between patron and sitter, and patron and paint and artist. There's a brilliant gaze in this painting. I really love the way that one eye is slightly more open than the other. We can only assume that that was a characteristic of this gentleman's face. He had one eye, which his right eye droops slightly more than his left upper eyelid. The glistening reflections in his tear duct and lower eyelid and the highlights on the pupil and iris really are quite evocative, actually. It's amazing how a touch of white paint can actually imbue a sense of profound emotion, because it's given his eyes a glassy, watery, reflective quality to them. And we can't help but feel that there is deep pathos and melancholy in that. When we cry, we get wet eyes and water, tears come out of our eyes. And so it looks almost as though there's something of that in that sort of emotion in the painting. Some people have speculated about Van Dyke's character and his melancholy side, and that he may have been actually quite a melancholy person. I think in the first of these workshops, perhaps I did mention it last week, that he had a very different temperament and persona to Rubens. Rubens was quite a formidable character who was successful in many different realms of public life, as a diplomat and as a courtier and as a painter for great houses all over Europe. Van Dyke's a much quieter person who we don't know as much about. He did travel a lot, and those beautiful reflections we have of him when he's talking to Sophonisba Angusola, and he writes down with such affection the advice that she gave him. You know, he seems to be I think Van Dyke must have been a very, very sensitive person. And I think that sensitivity comes out in these early paintings. Think about it, he's a very young man when he paints this, about 20, 21. And I think that, you know, when you're that age, you kind of, I mean, he's already brilliant. He's already established. He's already set for a life of great success. I think his paintings at this time do have this melancholy tone to them. If you look at this alongside the Cornelius van der Geest, which we will do in the next series. Obviously, we're doing Rubens in the next 3 weeks, which will be fun. You know, the next time we do Van Dyke, I'll compare this painting to the Cornelius van der Geest portrait. Look at the melancholy of them and make you all cry. No, I'm only joking. But so, you know, I think there is an emotional sensitivity in these early works. Okay, so I just want to skim over some of the things I wrote about Antwerp in this period, because it helps us to embed or clarify this distinction between portraits of merchants and portraits of aristocrats, which is a very, very important distinction. So Antwerp, okay, which is where Van Dyke is from. Okay, so obviously he visits England in 1620, and that marks the end of his first Antwerp period. Okay, so his visit to England is a transitional point. It's an important point in his life. He's introduced to a lot of different things. In Antwerp, he starts off as an apprentice. He's trained by Hendrik van Balen, as I mentioned earlier, and subsequently he's a journeyman under Sir Beautiful Rubens. Okay, so that's his first Antwerp period. Antwerp is a significant cultural, artistic, and economic centre in Northern Europe. Dutch and Flemish painting in the early 17th century is divided, as I've been saying, in terms of the great painters that characterize early 17th century painting. Great painters of this period often specialize in one or another of the two dominant types of portrait, either portraits of the mercantile, burgher, or administrative elites, or the aristocratic or monarchic type. The Protestant countries, such as the Netherlands, which becomes the Dutch Republic, adopt a more secular approach to all of their paintings, even their biblical and narrative paintings. They're distinctly not Catholic Reformation paintings, but they're visibly from a Dutch point of view, more Protestant point of view. And also the Dutch have their sort of still life paintings, secular and sometimes completely non-narrative still life paintings that simply indulge in the beauty of the objects and also speak of the new culture of luxury and the beauty and joy in consuming beautiful things like lobsters and fine glassware and fine metalware and things like that, which you see in the still life paintings of the Dutch 17th century. Sometimes they do have a moralizing or symbolic purpose to them, such as in the Vanitas paintings, which we all probably all of us rather like, actually. So in Antwerp, there is that in Antwerp and in Flanders more broadly, and in the Netherlands, they're both involved in this conflict between Catholic Europe and Protestant Europe. The Dutch revolt does encompass Antwerp as well, but then Antwerp re-enters the fold of the Catholic nations. And so these two types of portrait exist at the same time, and the distinction between the two types is very useful to recognize. It's very helpful if we recognize that. And it's interesting when there are conflicts within painting as well. Van Dyke is an anomaly in that he grapples with both, not just in his art, but in his own personal life as well. So in a few moments, I think we ought to move on and look at something else. And I will look at the time because I want us to get quite a lot done today. We're finishing up with Van Dyke for now, and then we are going to do another series on a different painter. We're going to do Van Dyke in the next series. So this is the last one on Van Dyke. What time is it now? Okay, I've already been doing 40 minutes, so we should probably move on. Are you all having fun, by the way? Is this you haven't all left, have you? You there are still some of you here, I hope. So where is everybody? So when he does actually leave Flanders, he goes to Italy, and there he really doesn't paint merchants. He certainly doesn't paint merchants in Genoa, although he may paint some. I'm not my research on that period isn't as extensive as his period painting English aristocrats during the Civil War. But in Genoa, he paints aristocrats mainly. And there is a difference in style. While this is a painting of a merchant, or more likely a painting portrait of a merchant, the clothes are far simpler, and he's not carrying a sword, and a sword or an aristocratic symbol would give us good grounds to say that this was an aristocrat. It's also, this painting is quite dynamic. If we think back to the pose is quite open. His hands are quite dynamic. He's not staying so still, this man, and he's got a very engaging look. He's not looking out into space. He's actually engaging with us. His head is turned at an interesting angle. His head is tilting at an interesting angle. This is a dynamic painting. He's not a static person. Now, this is something I've observed as being more associated, the dynamic pose being more associated with merchants than aristocrats. I think especially when Van Dyke is painting aristocrats, there's a certain stillness to them, a certain dignity in that stillness. I think the stillness elevates aristocrats, and because it means that, stillness being less, necessarily and obviously less dynamic, means that it's a bit flatter, because when you suggest movement in your subject, you suggest when you suggest movement in a painting, you're suggesting and alluding to the three dimensionality of the space depicted. When there isn't movement, when it's a static image without suggesting much movement at all, you're not alluding to or enhancing a sense of the three dimensionality of the environment. It appears flatter, and that makes the subject appear more remote. The world we live in is dynamic. The world we live in, and nature is constantly in movement. When things are still, they're outside of this domain. They're slightly more transcendent. And that is, for me, what really distinguishes the aristocratic portraiture from the mercantile portraiture. We can always find exceptions, and I'm sure we will. We might even find some tonight. But I think I will just plant that idea there as we are going to be moving on. Okay, so what are we going to look at now then? So here, this is a beautiful aristocratic portrait. She does not seem so dynamic, except for the subtle sense of movement left by these drapes, this astonishing dress. Now, this image, we're just going to sketch, because I want us to spend a bit more time with this image, because it occupies more of the screen if we zoom in a bit, and we get to focus more on her face and her sort of, the upper portion, and also the parrot there. This is quite a difficult image to work from, because on the screen that's going to appear very small and you won't be able to see much. So what I suggest is that just for a few moments we sketch this in and try and get a sense of the whole composition. And I think we can immediately tell immediately, which means in no time at all, we can tell that this is not a merchant. We can tell immediately that this is not a member of an administrative, social class, someone who works in sort of a legal profession, or a notary, or this is not a member of the burgher class. This is not an urban sort of elite, a trader, a merchant, or a banker. She's clearly a noble woman, and we can see that based on her attire, her expression is not dynamic on her face. We'll get a closer look at that, of course. But if we compare that to the earlier painting, okay, this is from 1627. So he is really coming to an end of his Genoese period now. We've skipped quite a few years here, actually, I must admit. It's quite a significant painting from his Genoese period. That's why I've made sure that this was in here, that we didn't miss it. It's also quite fun if we if we don't only look at men but look at women as well, because the portraits of women are often the most interesting, and we see how important and actually formidable women in early modernity truly were. And they often dominated households. So with this painting, we can see she's not a burgher or a merchant or a member of an urban class. She's an landed aristocrat. Okay, so you could expect that her circle of people are from a landowning, military, aristocratic background. And the red carpet and the beautiful red chairs, a similar chair. It's one of the compositional devices that Van Dyke transfers from his earlier paintings to his more mature paintings. So what have we got to say about this painting very quickly before we look more closely at her sort of close-up? What's the main difference between this painting and the previous one? Okay, so we've definitely got an aristocrat here. This is full length. This is a full-length portrait. And a full-length portrait is something that Van Dyke doesn't really do before before Genoa. In Italy, Van Dyke becomes increasingly aware of Lombard painting, Mannerist painting, Venetian High Renaissance painting. Think of Tintoretto, Veronese, Titian. Think of Mannerist and high and late Renaissance Italian painters like Correggio, and the Lombard painters of the mid to late 16th century, Moretto de Brescia, Giovanni Battista Moroni, and their use of the full-length portrait for the Italian nobility, for the regional aristocracy. You know, so this is a Van Dyke on an artistic journey, isn't it? You can really see the journey, and we can see the journey unfolding over the last few weeks, because now he is not just painting Flemish merchants, religious paintings, which are of a Catholic Reformation Catholic Reformation sensitivity or style. He's no longer there. He's not painting these sort of very engaging portraits. He's now on this journey. He's absorbing so much because, you know, he's been in London after leaving Antwerp for the first time, and he would have seen the great collections that Englishmen had built up, like Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel. He would have been at Arundel's collection and seen Titian for the first time. He would have seen Holbein as well in England. You know, so the century before Van Dyke arrived in England, you know, mainly in the 1530s, Holbein had left a tremendous legacy in England. And the stillness and remoteness of the Holbeins, think of Holbein's Thomas Cromwell or Thomas More. I mean, Arundel had the portrait of Cromwell, I believe. That's, you know, so Van Dyke may have actually seen that in Arundel's collection. Very still, very remote, very cold, very elevated and objective almost. And so now he's absorbing something new. He's seeing these great canvas paintings of the Lombard school. If you think of Giovanni Battista Moroni, I mean, you can go and see them in the Frick, you can go and see them at the Met, you can go and see them in the National Gallery in London. You know, those full-length aristocrat paintings are so incredibly, they combine so much loose and painterly style with such precise modeling of the facial features and the hands and the garb, the attire and the background. So there's something Lombard here as well. That's one of the things that makes Van Dyke so great, above and beyond his technical facility, which is you know, unsurmountable, unsurpassable. He is also very receptive to good ideas. So good ideas within the history of painting. And like I mentioned in the very first week, he is a painter who, even by his teens, is able to respond to, respond to all of the chief developments in the history of painting. And so here he's introducing ideas that are new to him in the full-length portrait, the very, very aristocratic mode of representation. So this is actually the largest of his Genoese paintings. He's in Genoa from around 1621 to 1627. In 1627, he goes back to Flanders, and he's there until 1632, which is when he settles in England. Where's my little, there it is. Okay, so all right, so he's in Flanders, he returns to Flanders 1627, 1628, and I've actually covered everything in my notes without even intending to. I wanted to leave something there for me to add before we go and look at the close-up. All right, so let's look at the close-up now then. So this is Paolina Adorno, portrait of Paolina Adorno. She is a member of the Genoese nobility. Okay, this is painted in 1627, so just before Van Dyke returns to Flanders. And he would have met Angusola by now. All the paintings we've looked at so far were before his encounter with Sophonisba Angusola. Not much is made of his encounter with Sophonisba Angusola in the scholarship. You know, and I only really know about it because of that drawing, which is at the British Museum. And because I'm interested in Sophonisba Angusola. So she's a painter that I'm really interested in, as you know, because we did a whole series on her, and then a year and a half or so ago, we did a workshop on her before I started doing the 3-part series. So you know, so I'm interested, and that's how I know there's a connection between Van Dyke and Angusola, and I think that this is the first painting we've looked at by Van Dyke after his encounter with Angusola in 1624. This is in 1627, so a few years after his encounter with her, the great painter of Cremona, who was living in Palermo and who died in 1624. At the year she died very soon after Van Dyke left. There was a plague in Palermo at that time, but I'm not sure if she died of plague. She would have been in her 90s, but I don't know if she died of the plague. But here, what do we have? What makes her an aristocrat other than this very, very fine, like amazingly fine clothing? You know, all the gold thread. You know, this is someone with ridiculous amounts of money, richer than any of the merchants, and they have to be wealthier because there's a whole social order to maintain. The idea of aristocrats not being above the merchants is completely unthinkable in the early modern world. It's sort of like the idea of a merchant being more powerful or more prestigious or dressed better than an aristocrat would be a perturbation in nature, you know, a perturbation in the natural and organic order of things. Ever since Aristotle, in the we've got someone unmuted. Is that someone asking?
Yeah,
it's
it's
Bastian, how are you?
I have a question, because I assume that, you know, knowing the Flanders and the Flemish cities are probably the one that has been the first to actually negotiate their burgher status. So Ghent, Antwerp, so probably the relationship with aristocracy in Italy or in Antwerp was totally different. So that's a question for you, because I just wonder how much, when his Antwerp, you know, there are really cities where the merchants are established almost for a very long time, and it might be more part of the culture, while in Italy it might have a very different society to paint and to meet. So
that's fantastic, Bastien. I'm so happy you're here, and it's so nice to have someone ask a question, and that is a fantastic question, because this is a question of the cultural history, and it's very important. And you're right in saying that in Italian culture during the early modern period, from the 16th century into the 17th century, it is very different to how it was in Flanders and in the Netherlands, especially after the Dutch revolt and the expulsion of the Spanish monarchy. And in Italy, if we just describe Italy for a moment, there is no ruling monarch. Milan is often sort of at odds with France during the Renaissance, and you know, Milan is often being invaded by the French, and they are defended by a military dynasty. And that is how Italian city-states are really characterized politically and by their elite members, their elite inhabitants. Italy doesn't have a centralized monarchy, whereas England and France, they do. So the aristocrats have much more power in Italy, but they have very regional power, and they're always at war with each other. The most peaceful place in Italy in the early modern period, especially in the Renaissance, is Venice. Venice isn't really at war with the other city-states as often, whereas if you compare Florence, Florence is a city-state which is always at war with its competitors within the Tuscan region, like Pisa and Lucca and Pistoia and so on. So the Italian nobility are highly militarized. Now, then they are land owning, and they also start to operate within banking. But one thing that they're not allowed to do or can't do is have a mercantile sort of income. It's really kind of not proper. It would breach the orders of propriety. And so with the Italian aristocracy, they have a completely different culture, outlook, and purpose, really, essentially, to the mercantile or burgher class in the Netherlands and in Flanders. Now, with the Netherlands and Flanders, there's a far greater importance on international trade. Now, in Italy, you can say that, well, there was trade, and you know, the Florentines were very, very important in the sort of fabrics trade and the wool trade in the Renaissance, but they're also an important center for banking. And that status quo, if you want to call it that, between the sort of banking and mercantile class and the aristocracy in Florence was really subverted by the Medici. in the early 15th century, and the bankers became the most powerful people within Republican Florence. And obviously, Venice also is a republic. It's not ruled as it's not an aristocratic sort of structure. It's a republican structure, and so there is a degree of popular participation within the political decision making and policy making, which isn't the case in somewhere like Milan. Okay, so because Milan is dominated by a military dynasty, an aristocratic military dynasty. With the Low Countries, with Antwerp, with Flanders, you can see my little boy. Hello, Rocco. With and the Dutch mercantile elites, they have a completely different source of wealth and a completely different culture, and they kind of present in a very elite way, almost appearing aristocratic, but never with this sort of over the top display of wealth. And I think there's a lot to do with Protestantism in the Netherlands, at least, perhaps to a lesser degree in Antwerp, although while Antwerp is Catholic, it still has a very, very mercantile base. And so that's what makes it such an interesting place in early modernity, is that while it retains its Catholicism, it has its primary sort of, its elite are primarily a mercantile elite, but there's also lots of their society is actually quite complicated, because they don't only have a mercantile elite, but they have quite an international. It's a very, very international society, with aristocrats and merchants all occupying the same place. Whereas with the Netherlands, it's, because it's explicitly Protestant and sometimes quite Calvinistic, and so a very, very kind of rigid form of Protestantism, there's less of a display of aristocraticism and more of a display of I'm tempted to say work ethic, but I'm trying to avoid the Weberian phrase, the Protestant work ethic, and the spirit of Protestantism. The spirit of Protestant work, the spirit of capitalism, and the Protestant work ethic, by Max Weber. But there's something to be said for the Protestant spirituality of the Netherlands, and how their elites and mercantile elites don't present as aristocrats in this way, because anything that is visibly ornate to this degree is considered to be sort of under the influence of the Italian or Spanish nations, and thereby sort of Catholic in taste and temperament and aesthetic, and there would have been some controversy around that. I don't know if I'm answering your question to a satisfaction.
Yeah. So it's still the case today in the Netherlands, and you're not supposed to show off your wealth, but but it answers it. So I was thinking that the people he's painting want to be represented in a certain way, so it forces evolution, but it's also, I suppose, he couldn't mix. So his clients would ask a certain style representing their status, so he needs to adapt to that.
Yeah. But I think that Van Dyke would have been instrumental in determining the style that they would be depicted in, because he's also sort of taking ideas from his surroundings and the paintings that he's seeing. So I don't know how much of he would know already how he's going to depict someone, because there would simply be a conventional or an appropriate or a proprietous way in which to depict someone like her, which is kind of a pre-established thing that is not really negotiable, because of her status. It determines how he has to depict her. So I don't know if she would actually say, I want you to paint me like an aristocrat. It's more like, you're an aristocrat, so I have to paint you like one. And but yeah, with the Netherlands, the Protestant, sometimes even Calvinistic character of Dutch portraiture, there's more of a quiet faithfulness underlying the portraits of these people, and they're often depicted at work as well. So if you think of Rembrandt's group portraits of Rembrandt's group portraits and group portraits by Frans Hals. If you think of Frans Hals with his meager company, if you think of Rembrandt with his night watch, if you think of Rembrandt with his anatomy lesson, where you have the doctor conducting an anatomy lesson, these are very secular paintings of secular urban elites that are not aristocrats, and they're depicted doing secular things like working. And that is not something that you would expect in an Italian 17th century painting, in a Catholic 17th century painting. Catholic paintings are far grander. There's always a deeper sort of spiritual undertone. Even with the secular sort of history paintings that are painted in the, if you think of Velázquez with the Surrender of Breda, that's a secular painting of a secular historical event where the Spanish king is accepting the keys to this town of Breda from the Dutch, having defeated the Dutch army, and the Dutch are surrendering. Even that is depicted in a more ornate and Catholic way compared to the Dutch style, which is more secular and earthly and not as sort of grandiose. I love your question, Bastian, and you're having a discussion with you during the session is really fun, and I'm sure that it makes it more fun for everyone else as well when we have really lovely questions and insights shared by the participants. So that's really fantastic. Is there anything else you would ask or comment about there, Bastian?
No, not directly. I think it's quite fascinating to see how they were still going from one style to another, and how this all evolves on the background of cultural and it's big divides, huh? The divide between the Latin world and the more Anglo-Saxon world, and then between the Protestant and the Catholic makes a huge difference.
I know.
So, yeah. So you still feel it today when you go from Brussels to Amsterdam. You have all those differences are still present in the people today. So, which I think is fascinating.
So Brussels is where is Antwerp in relation to Brussels?
It's 45 minutes north. So, or it's 30 minutes drive. So it's super close. It's 60 kilometers north.
Oh, I would love to go. And so and you notice a stark difference between there and Amsterdam.
Oh, well, yeah, the style in the houses, that's for sure. But even if you work there a bit, because I worked in the Netherlands, I worked in Belgium, and you really feel, just the way the society behave, the way people, the work ethics, all that is it's slightly different. So that makes the cultural differences. But it's the same if you go, in other countries. If you go to Italy, you still have
certainly
those differences are still present today. So
all bound up with the difference between the Catholic countries, the Anglo-Saxon or Latin. It's amazing, isn't it? And it's amazing how all of this variety in Europe itself is all connected to, we all share we all have a shared cultural genesis in Greco-Roman antiquity, but with our own variations and additional things, like, with obviously in England, the Anglo-Saxon genealogy is infused with the Greco-Roman and Hellenic. So it's amazing how varied Western or European culture is. And obviously Western culture is incredibly varied, but it all is unified under certain origins, which is a connection to Greek and Roman antiquity, is where we're really from. And today there's such difference, just regional differences. You can, as Vinciane is saying, from Antwerp, you can then go to Amsterdam and see such a stark difference. There's such variety and diversity already built in to cultures that are very, very much European. It's quite remarkable. It's a great continent. It's a fantastic, it's a great culture. I love it. I love the variety within it. It's just, when I go to the National Gallery, when you go to the National, and you know, the difference you're talking about there as well, Vinciane, is that, you know, the difference in Europe, you can experience that just by going to the National Gallery, because they have in the Sainsbury wing, you've got all of the early Renaissance paintings, you know, Cimabue, Giotto, Duccio, Sasetta, Piero della Francesca, Pietro Perugino and Verrocchio, Luca Signorelli, and so on. So you've got the Sainsbury wing full of these early Renaissance Italian painters. Plus you've got some of Dürer's paintings, Leonardo, Mantegna, Bellini. You've got Roger van der Weyden, Jan van Eyck. You've got that, you know, within just the Sainsbury wing, you've got all these, you know, these are paintings from the, you know, the early 15th century, early to mid 15th century. And it's you know, 15th century as a whole. And like that, you can immediately detect, you can almost feel just you can see the difference, the regional differences between you know, a Sienese painting and a Dutch painting from the same period, and that's before the Reformation. You know, so it even transcends the sort of Catholic and Protestant divide. So I think a break would be good. I think that maybe a little break would be wonderful, actually, not only for me, but everyone here taking part. And it would be also brilliant to see some drawings by you. But before we take a break, I would like to ask, what time is it? Is that actually the time? Oh, okay, right, it's 8:15. What blue as Van Dyke used there? We all know about ultramarine, don't we? Do we think this is ultramarine? Is this painted with ultramarine?
No.
No, it's not. What blue? Is that Tatiana?
Yes,
What blue do you think it is?
it was me. But I don't, well, it looks like this German blue, Prussian blue.
Yeah. But
But I don't think that they had it at that time.
you're very well informed about paint, Tatiana. Well, you can tell that it's not ultramarine, and you're correct there.
Definitely.
With Prussian blue, it comes in a little bit later. There is another blue which is introduced. Look, what are the blues? So we've got ultramarine, which is an ancient blue.
Cobalt.
Pardon?
Cobalt.
Cobalt is even later than that.
Okay.
Cobalt blue and cerulean blue, these blues come in much, much later.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a forerunner to cobalt blue. This is smalt. Smalt is a kind of, it is a kind of cobalt pigment because it's based on a kind of cobalt glass, which is produced by a chemical reaction. I'm not an expert on smalt. Obviously, it's no mystery that ultramarine is based on a rock, which has to be broken down and purified and separated into different grades and then ground into a binder to be painted with. Oh, I think I'm getting some funny feedback noise there, so I'll just mute out everyone. Just and you can unmute if you want to ask a question or contribute something. But yes, smalt is another blue pigment that was introduced in the 17th century. Okay, so a much more affordable blue than lapis lazuli. There was another blue, azurite, but azurite is isn't as reliable, and smalt might not be so reliable either. So it's quite surprising that this is in such good, appears to be in good condition. Don't know what it looked like originally, but there you go. So beautiful parrot, another aristocratic thing. Aristocrats love exotic creatures, and so there's a beautiful parrot there. She's also holding a beautiful rose in her right hand, and she's looking directly at us, but yet not in a way which appears to be dynamic. She isn't turning or tilting her head. We just have a very conventional 3/4 view, which is associated with the Renaissance portrait and the Renaissance aristocrat. That's what Van Dyke would have seen in Lombard full-length portraiture. So he's bringing his Flemish approach and assimilating that within, integrating an Italian approach within it, which is completely brilliant and unique. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stop recording while we take a break, and okay, so we've just had a little break. Some of the work that we saw was absolutely brilliant. I really loved, all of the work we saw was just brilliant. What was I saying? Some of it, all of it was. Really loved Anne's beautiful sketchbook drawing and Rian's beautiful drawings on individual sheets, really fantastic. And that's one of the wonderful things about taking part in the Zoom, isn't it? Is that we get to see each other's work. And so yeah, let's get back to what we're doing. So yeah, this beautiful aristocratic portrait. What is next? I've forgotten. So what is next? Ah, yes, brilliant. So this is a beautiful, beautiful portrait of an aristocrat. Yet he's just wearing black attire like that, but that big ruff thing like that is very Italian. Although he is not an Italian, he's actually a Dutchman. Ferdinand van, how do I say his name correctly? Vincian, can you help me? Is that, how do I say his name?
Ferdinand van Boyschot.
Boyschot. Ferdinand van Boyschot, yeah. So so he is really an aristocrat, okay, this guy. While he is Dutch, he is a Catholic. And he's the Baron of Baron of Zaventem. And so he is a hereditary nobleman from the Low Countries, from the Netherlands. And this painting was made in 1630, which is after Van Dyke's period in Italy. Okay, so he's become incredibly experienced. He's consolidated his style of the aristocratic portrait. And at this point, he is back in Flanders. So he returns to Flanders from Italy, and he is there. He attempts to establish new streams of patronage, to re-establish a new kind of career, to, a new phase in his career, and then eventually does settle in England and becomes court painter to Charles I. So this is in the years leading up to that. Okay, so we're quite far along now in our journey studying about Van Dyke. I'm going to give you some time to draw this. Okay, I want you quick sketch of this, and then we're going to look at something else very quickly before we focus on his head and face. Okay, so don't worry about the head and face too much at this point. Sketch the whole thing in, and then in a few moments, in a few minutes, we'll look at a close-up of the face so that you get to capture his likeness. Okay, so this is Ferdinand van Boyschot. He's the Baron of Zaventem, and so he's an aristocrat from the Netherlands, and his father was a defender of Spanish rule during the Dutch revolt in the Netherlands. And so he is a member of the Dutch and Flemish elite who isn't of that merchant class. He's of a different kind of elite. I think you can see quite a bit of underpainting in this painting, okay, which I'll talk about a bit later, unless what's around him is actually a kind of fur cloak. We'll have to take a closer look, okay, but before I get too absorbed in other things, we'll talk a bit about him and about this painting. in terms of its style and the sort of cultural history attached to it. In other words, context. So we've looked at portraits that Van Dyke has done of people from this place in this sort of time, the first half of the 17th century. Rather than an aristocratic elite, his focus at the start was the mercantile elite. Having returned to Flanders from Genoa, he has cultivated a really aristocratic style. And that is what we can see on display here. When he returns to Flanders, he's here painting an aristocrat, a baron, and his family has a history of defending the Spanish monarchy and its rule in the Netherlands. Obviously, Flanders becomes reabsorbed into Catholic Europe, whereas the Dutch Netherlands maintain republican status with a Protestant society. So this baron was born in the Spanish Netherlands, and his father had died during the Dutch Revolt, which occurred between 1560 and 1648. So his family were instrumental in the defense of the Spanish monarchy and their rule in the Netherlands. He, at this point, is not just an aristocrat, Ferdinand van Boyskot. He's also a jurist and a diplomat. So an aristocrat who is a member of the elite in a political sort of bureaucratic sense, as well as in an aristocratic sense. But he doesn't have that status because of his wealth or because of his mercantile capabilities, his finances. That has nothing to do with his status. It's more his military background and the military reputation of his family. He was, in fact, knighted, or not knighted, but made a knight of. Okay, so he would have been an aristocrat anyway, because he was born into aristocraticism. But he was made a knight of the Order of Santiago. The Order of Santiago is a chivalric knightly order, a Spanish one, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because he's a Dutchman. And it shows you the connection between the Catholic Dutch and the Spanish, which is quite visceral. It's quite a visceral topic because the Dutch were Protestant generally, and they rejected Catholicism. Whereas in this painting, we have a man who is Dutch and Catholic and has been even knighted by the Spanish king. So it was Philip III who knighted him as a knight of the Order of Santiago. The Knights of Santiago is one of the most prestigious noble orders in Spain. It's one of the highest ranking knightly orders. And so for a Dutchman to be a knight of the Order of Santiago is quite astonishing, quite rare. And it makes that complex history even more exciting because there's something paradoxical about it from a general outside point of view. So he's a Dutchman who defended the Spanish monarchy and also was knighted by its king and became a member of the Knights of the Order of Santiago. Painted in 1630, just before Van Dyke, a couple of years before Van Dyke moved to England. And so this is anticipating that English style. He brings this approach of aristocraticism, painting aristocraticism and the aristocratic persona. He brings that to England in 1632. Now, what are the differences between this painting and his earlier paintings? We looked at that wonderful painting that he did of the merchant, what we think is a merchant, but we can put a pretty strong claim. We can put a pretty strong claim together to argue that the first painting we looked at this evening was a painting of a merchant. What are the differences? There is no dynamic posturing. There is no tilting of the head. There's no real turning of the head. There isn't that sense of human emotion and melancholy in the eyes. It's a more stern and strong and dignified. It's very static, and therefore he's not really moving in the space that he's depicted in. With the earlier ones, with the more Antwerp, in the style of his paintings from his first Antwerp period up until 1620, 1621, his sitters seem to be in a more, their hands seem to be more mobile and more dynamic, and their faces seem to be more emotive and tilted in a more engaging and dynamic way. Why is this person painted in a more static way? His shoulders are symmetrical. He's standing with a very straight poise. It's that stillness doesn't create a sense of three dimensionality. The sense of three-dimensionality is accentuated when we have a dynamic pose, because a dynamic pose suggests movement in space. Movement in space makes it more of an experience. It creates that visual experience of three dimensions, because movement implies a distension in space, whereas something that is static is less suggestive of that distension in space. And if we have a more static image, we have a more two-dimensional image. If we have a more two-dimensional image, we have an image which is more remote physically from this world. If we have an image which is more physically remote from this world, it's placed kind of beyond the natural order in a more objective or a more remote or elevated way or place. If you're an aristocrat, that might be how you think you ought to be depicted. It seems more dignified. If you think about the earlier paintings, more, slightly more dynamic, more engaging, more emotive. It's more earthly, it's more natural, it's less formal. This painting is more formal. We don't have that sort of human melancholy or that sense of emotional vulnerability that we have in the earlier work. What we've got here is a knight of Santiago, someone whose father died defending the Spanish aristocracy. We've got a diplomat, we've got a jurist, we have a baron. It's not an earthly thing, it's an elevated aristocratic and noble background and persona. It's a completely different persona. Would you have really appreciated that just from looking at one and then the other painting, the first and then the other painting? But does all of this reflection on the broader culture and the different, having this sort of deeper comparison, actually illuminate what these paintings really are and what they really express? I think it's very helpful to see these together, actually, because the difference is quite profound. Oh, yeah, and yet they're both painted by Van Dyke. You know, it's a completely different persona that he's captured here, but it's still a portrait. We've got, you know, a three-quarter portrait up to the thighs. And yet it's a completely different kind of persona. So what we'll do, I want to give us some time to look at each other's work. So like, basically, you don't have to worry about how much time I give you, because you can have unlimited time. In these workshops, I'm now going to be putting the names of the things and where they are, so that you can find them. And also these workshops are going to be on YouTube, so you can, you know, just watch it whenever you want. Oh, Gerda's leaving some nice comments in the box. Actually, Venice had Turks to battle with and trade with. It was more the Byzantines who were battling the Turks, and the Venetians weren't giving them enough help. And that culminated in 1453 with the overthrow of the Byzantine Empire, with the fall of Constantinople, which is the greatest tragedy in history, which should never have been allowed to have happened. And he looks every. Does it say, do you mean severe or every? I wonder what you...
Severe, I don't know
Severe.
another word in English.
Yeah, severe. Yeah, he does look severe.
And not, what did I say? And a man with compassion. That's he is not. He likes the Spanish order, I think. They're quite severe. Okay.
I totally agree with you. I think that's it, really, Gerda. He looks very severe. And what was the other adjective you used to describe him? No, what did you say? Less.
Less.
Sympathy or empathy, or what did you say?
He doesn't seem to have much empathy. He doesn't seem to be the emotional man that Van Dyke himself is as a person.
Mm.
So that's maybe why Van Dyke painted him as a distant, objective, yes, someone who represents authority.
Very good insights, Gerda.
Connection, yes.
A man who represents authority, painted him in a way that represents authority. That is a very, very good insight. I often overlook things that are very important, so it's very helpful of you to point these things out. So thank you very much. And yeah, I think I agree with you. He is very severe and doesn't have that sense of empathy, and he doesn't appear as vulnerable. I think it does represent power. And I think there are lots of things we can discuss when talking about the difference between this painting and the more humane paintings that Van Dyke executed earlier. One of them could be as simple as a technical reason. What technical reason could there be that the painting is more formal? He had less time with the sitter, could be one. If this man is a very high status, you know, aristocrat who represents authority, as you say, Gerda, he, you know, may have only had an hour to work with him.
It's a man with power, so you better take some care, you know?
Perhaps there was a
You
level of...
want to have a quarrel with him.
Perhaps there was a level of intimidation. And Clarche is here. I can't believe it. I've missed you, Clarche. I'm so happy you're here tonight. I really hope you are enjoying the workshop. The pose is easier to hold too, maybe. Well, I wonder if the sitter would even hold a pose, or maybe Van Dyke would kind of invent some of it. Maybe he would just paint the face from life, and the rest would be done in the workshop in collaboration with other sitters. What I would like to do, that's a brilliant question, that's a brilliant comment though, Clarche, thank you very much. One thing I would like to do before we look at something else, okay, is just to glance back at what we've been. So we're going to finish with this main image here, and we're going to glance back, okay. Far more dynamic, left shoulder up, hands in, you know, a far more relaxed poise. It looks as though he's just walked there, placed his hands in a very organic way. He's very alive. This is a very living pose. It radiates movement, okay, and natural movement. Also, look at the vulnerability in the eyes, in the face, okay, so the expression is very human. He's got emotion and, you know, feeling in the eyes, kind of vulnerability that Van Dyke has the power to reflect in his work. We compare that to this painting, that doesn't really seem to be there as much. Now, what about this crest here, this cross, the Order of the Knights of Santiago? This is very exciting because this is the Order of Knights. This is the Order of Knighthood. This is the noble order that Diego Velázquez would join. Here we've got Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, one of his last paintings. Velázquez died in 1659, I believe. His last series of paintings culminated with Las Hilanderas in 1657. This is one of the last paintings he ever did. It's the Maids of Honor, or Las Meninas, painted for the King and Queen of Spain, Philip IV. And we've got the Infanta Margarita there. On the left, we've got Diego Velázquez in the act of painting. And then if we look closer at Velázquez, he is wearing that cross on his breast, Knights of the Order of Santiago. He enters the Spanish nobility. He may have painted this crest, this cross on his breast subsequently, because he wasn't a member of the Order of the Knights of Santiago at the point of painting this canvas, but afterwards. So that may be a later addition. Aristocraticism has kind of been mentioned in all of these workshops. And what we've got here is a contemporary of Van Dyke, born in the very same year. Van Dyke had already died by the time that Velázquez painted Las Meninas, because Van Dyke died in 1641. But what we've got is a painter in Velázquez, born in 1599, same year as Sir Anthony van Dyke. And here he's depicted as a member of this knightly order, the Order of the Knights of Santiago. The same, which is on the breast of this Dutchman here. Very interesting, okay? So I'm really excited when I put this slide in. So here's our close-up. This is the last thing that we're going to draw. And I wonder how long have we got? We do not have long at all, everyone. I really want us to have enough time to look at some work and have a chat and play with the dog before I end the workshop today. This is the close-up. I kind of would say that there is a bit of emotion in those eyes. Maybe I went too far in my early discussion on. I think he does look like he's got a really stern and severe character. I agree with Gerda. He doesn't have the sense of vulnerability that the other painting had, of the unknown. He looks a bit nervous. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, perhaps Clutch. Yeah, maybe you're very good at reading people and I'm not. Maybe you're good at seeing people's... his kind of chin is kind of doing that. He looks slightly defensive, perhaps. Would you say? It may be. It is fabulous, isn't it? And you can see that lead white pigment has been used. The thing with lead white paint, if you ever handle lead white paint, you don't have to dilute it with turpentine or a kind of lavender oil. You know, lavender oil is an oil which evaporates and it kind of can be used to dilute and thin oil colors. And that's what would have been used historically rather than turpentine, although Rubens did start using turpentine and Van Dyke probably did use it as well. But even if you don't dilute lead white with either lavender oil or turpentine, just working it with the brush makes it kind of looser. It's the unique character of lead white pigment, especially lead white, which is made in the historical way, behaves in this, it reacts to touch. And when you work it with a palette knife or a brush, it kind of loosens. And then when you it kind of becomes more solid if you strike it. It's a it's an amazing paint. And you can see that the lead white has kind of been laced on, essentially. It's he laces paint. He's a really amazing painter. You know, I haven't spoken that much about his technique today at all, but it's one of the greatest aspects of Van Dyke is the technique. He's an absolute complete genius at painting itself. Yeah, he's fantastic. All right, so we don't have very long, so I need us to have time to look at some of your work at the end. And yeah, those of you who are watching on YouTube should definitely take part in the live events so that you get to be a part of, you know, a live part of the community. Although if it's not a good time for you, then, you know, you can just watch it on YouTube. Yeah, I really hope that you've all enjoyed it. This series has been a lot of fun for me. Don't often talk about 17th century artists. Have spoken about some 17th century. I don't think I've done any 18th century. I've done 20th century. We did Picasso once, didn't we? Remember? That was a while ago now.
Yeah, it was.
Pauline, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, you enjoyed the Picasso one, did you?
I did, yes.
Yeah, it was
Very
good.
much. I'm enjoying this as well.
Good, I'm very pleased. And so yeah, Van Dyke, what an adventure we've had, and we haven't even really started. We've only just started with Van Dyke. I can't wait to do our next series on him, which is where we will be back in England, and we'll have to learn a bit about the English Civil War, and that will be really fun. I think that'll be a great series. That'll be a fantastic series. It'll be a lot of fun putting that together. I'll get to do a lot of reading. I'll get to do a lot of research for that, and I'll really enjoy doing that. And I'll feel even more like someone who doesn't live in the modern world, which I don't. I feel like I live in the early modern world, and I basically do. So thank you very much for helping me stay on the right track and be committed to this historical drawn from history workshop. Thank you very much for taking part today. I really hope you enjoyed it. Next week we'll be doing Rubens, and so I'll send out the link for that every Monday as usual. And if you're new to the workshop, thank you for joining. If you're watching on YouTube, just go on to renaissanceworkshop.com and look at the sign up thing where you can put your email in and get the invite every week. And I really look forward to drawing with you very soon and talking about the art history of art with you very soon. So thank you everyone for taking part. It's been wonderful tonight. I've really enjoyed it, and this has been a great series on Van Dyke. Yeah. You all have fun? Did you enjoy that?
Yes.
It's great.
Very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
All right. So what I'll do now is I'll stop recording, and I'll do that. I'll stop the recording now.